Okay, welcome to week 11 of social science research methods. Today we're going to be talking about ethics and experiments. That might seem like a strange pairing to you, but these two topics actually go really well together when talking about social science research methods because although we definitely need to be considering ethical best practices across all research, it is often in the experiments where we tend to lose our way. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. Okay, let's jump in. Principles of ethics. Um, Basically, you want to maximize the benefit for your research participants while minimizing any risk or potential for harm to them as a direct result of participation in your study. You want to treat your participants with respect and dignity. You want to make sure that you obtain informed consent from them, and we'll talk about consent in a little bit. You want to make sure that you and any of the co-principal investigators that you're working with have created a structure and a system of responsibility and accountability. Everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing, how they're supposed to be doing it, and when and where they're supposed to be doing it. And that lastly, there are no conflicts of interest between the people that you'll be studying and organizations that may be funding your research. But if there are conflicts of interest, you say them explicitly and at the beginning so that it's not a surprise. Okay, let's talk about consent because that's the really big part about ethics is making sure that your participants understand what the research project is that they're participating in, how their data will be collected, stored, used, and potentially published at a later date, and what recourse, if any, do they have for any of this stuff not working out as it's laid out in the consent form? It is very important that as a part of our performance of the role as scientists in these interactions, and remember we talked about a couple of weeks ago in the ethnography section that there is a big performance piece to being a social scientist where you're typically not in a lab, you are out in the social world, but you're also trying to reinforce to people what your role is in that particular setting. Um, However, as we learned in the Milgram obedience to authority experiment, which I'll talk about in a little bit, scientists can be, what's the word that I'm looking for? Um, the idea, the perception of the identity of scientists can feel very coercive, influential in a way that participants that you're interacting with feel as though they may not have the choice not to participate because you are in a position of power as the scientist. And so your suggestions almost feel like requirements as opposed to something that the participant or potential participant has complete control over. So making sure that you are not intimidating your potential participants via your identity as scientist, as researcher in these settings, and instead is laying out for them a very clear understanding without any jargon that's easily readable for anybody, what the project is and how they will be included in it. And they, only when they agree to participate, do you take the data collection any further. Okay, a piece of the consent is confidentiality and anonymity. So, how will you hide or not their identities? Have you decided that? Does this person agree to let you use their real name or a pseudonym or a letter or a number or a series of numbers? How will their other facets of their identities be masked or made confidential? Will you say where they work, how old they are, what they do, where they live? Will you obscure some of that information? Will you change it to make it difficult to identify who your participants are? By extension, where will this data be stored? Who will have access to it? How long will it be stored before it's destroyed? Who might come upon these identities and mess up these confidentiality and anonymity agreements that you have with your participants, and making sure that you have closed any loopholes so there aren't any mess ups, and that you can ensure your participant that their identities are protected as a part of your research project. As a scientist, it is your ethical responsibility to maintain um, positive and balanced relationships, roles, to provide safety and participant freedom to stop and start participation in the data collection process. If at any time somebody doesn't feel safe or free to participate or not, you have not met your goal as the researcher. Here are just a couple of suggestions for good practice. You want to make sure that you are involving experts and academics to the conversation so that you are on top of the topic. And by extension, the second part, you want to be sure that you've done a thorough reviewing of the literature so you understand where this project stands relative to existing research in the field. You want to be mindful of local norms of the participants that you're asking to join into your research, and how you may adjust things like consent forms or even organizing the project as a whole to consider those local norms. And then any external guidelines given to you by the institution or the funding source that need to be added as part of the research. So those are all just a few suggestions for good practice of ethics in social science research. And then here I have this handy dandy checklist. You can screenshot it and continue to refer back to it as you're doing your projects now and in the future to ensure that your research is ethical. That's a really important feature of social science research, where we're dealing with humans a lot more than some of the other disciplines. Okay, let's shift now and talk about experiments, because I said at the beginning that experiments are sometimes where ethics goes off the rails a little bit, especially in the social sciences. And that's because experiments help us understand and investigate cause and effect relationships in these highly controlled environments. Those types of environments could be a lab environment, right? That's totally closed and controlled by the researcher. A field environment, which is a much more likely environment for an experiment in the social sciences, where you're out in the social world, but you still are trying to control some facets of setting or identity in order to create this cause and effect dynamic that experiments are best suited for. And then comparisons. You could do experiments that are comparisons across groups of people's behaviors and responses, as opposed to examinations of just one or a set of independent variables. So I said before that experiments allow us to investigate cause and effect relationships. And actually, that's really important, because I'm sure that you remember from the quantitative section me saying that one thing that most quantitative modeling in social statistics can't do is tell us about the causal relationships between variables. Instead, what we get are correlative relationships between variables. So what is the correlation between this dependent variable and this independent variable, as one goes up, the other goes down, as one goes up, the other goes up, and so on and so forth. But we do want to be able to say things about causation from time to time, and experiments allow us to do that. Um, um, but I just want to reiterate that it's not valid for it's not a valid methodological choice for most of the social science research that we undergo. Having said that, I'm going to talk about a couple that are important in a second. So here, just some principles of experimental design. Control, right? You want to create a set of dependent and independent variables that allow you to study the causal relationship between them, and minimize the existence of any other non-testing variables in that space. You want to make sure that you have randomized your participants in such a way that their individual responses based on their own sort of human, cultural, social capital will not skew the data. And then lastly, you want to replicate your experiment as many times as possible so that you can be sure that the cause and effect relationship that you're seeing is one that actually exists in the social world. So that's how we, quote unquote, do social science experiments. Some things to consider about experiments, and I would screenshot this and refer back to it as you are thinking about experiments as a methodological tool that you might use. It boils down to experiments are hard. It's hard to create a set of variables that you can control in the social world. It's hard not to do experiments in the field as social scientists and to do them in a lab, which would allow for some more of that control. Replication takes time, randomization takes time. Um, and and so experiments are one of those things where there really has to be this perfect synergy between the research question and the experimental model method to have it really tell us something good. And we're going to get to now some important social experiments. You'll remember actually, that was now I'm thinking about it. That was another class. So one of the best modern examples of social science experiments in the field that were really innovative and told us something new about the social world comes from Diva Pager. She was a sociologist at Harvard. She recently passed away of cancer. But her defining work was called The Mark of a Criminal Record, and it was an experimental audit employment study in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So what she did in this study was that she went to Milwaukee and she um, hired a bunch of participants whose job it was to go around to stores advertising hiring to apply. She paired these black and white men up by height, weight, level of attractiveness, eye color to randomize as much as possible the experiment process, but also minimize control variables, um, uh, not control variables, to minimize and control variables such that they're not mediating and moderating variables about these individual men that's impacting whether or not they get called back for a job. She also controls for their resumes where all of the participants have similar resumes, and the only differences are the names of the schools, but they're like in ranking at the same level. But she randomizes whether or not you have a criminal record or not. And so she sent these men out to give their resumes out to these organizations that were hiring, and she wanted to see how many people would get called back based on having a criminal record or not. Well, what she found was that race was actually a much bigger indicator of whether or not one of her participants would be called back. And white men with a criminal record were called back at higher rates than black men without a criminal record. So that's a really good example of a modern day ethical experiment that is out in the field of the social world, but also is able to maintain some control over the available variables. Two other experiments that we talk a lot about in the social sciences, but that are completely unethical and would not get through the IRB in 2020 are the Stanley Milgram obedience to authority experiment and the Zambrano Stanford prison experiment. The obedience to authority experiment took place at Yale in the 1950s, and Milgram advertised for participants for a research project in the newspaper. Those people would come in along with actors that he hired as part of the experiment to his office that was listed in the advertisement, and they were told that they would be paid to participate in a learning audit study, a memory study. So essentially, you read a set of words to your partner, and you're trying to gauge how many they remember back to. And if they don't remember them all, then they get a little punishment. And what the punishment was in this experiment was an electric shock that was connected to their fingers. The participants didn't know was that the partners that they were being paired with were the actors. So they were set in different rooms. The actual participants are the ones controlling the voltage, they think, and the actors are the ones who are receiving the voltage, the participants think. And in 60% of the participating experiments, the participant was willing to take the voltage all the way to the end, regardless of what negative feedback or screams of pain and suffering or eventual silence they were getting from their partners. That's completely unethical because it caused a lot of psychological harm to the participants after the fact, but it's a really good way to think about how our role as scientists may instigate feelings of powerlessness in people, which coerces them into doing things and participating in our research in ways that they might not be totally comfortable with. And then the last one is the Stanford prison experiment. I'm sure you've heard of this one, where another ad was put in a newspaper to participate in this experiment. You would either be a guard in this fake prison or prisoner. You wouldn't know which you were going to be. You were taken off the street and put into this. This is a lab experiment because now you're completely controlling this prison. It's not out in the social world. And that experiment had to stop after just a few days because the participants who were labeled as the guards were quickly embodying all of the negative characteristics of being a guard. We're engaging in mental and physical intimidation of the participants who were the prisoners. Some people left, some people had nervous breakdowns, again, caused a lot of psychological harm and some physical harm. So it's not an experiment that you would see done in 2020, but is a really interesting study about how people subsume power and exploit power even in these sort of fake constructed environments. All right. That is all that I have for you today. I'm going to leave you with our active learning exercise, which is about the dating show on Netflix, Love is Blind. If you haven't seen it yet, I would check it out and think about how you might restructure this particular experiment to better answer its research question, which is love blind? And we'll talk about it in discussion this week. I'll see you then.